fourth method. Key point I think we should keep in mind when thinking about the matrilineal standard of the Mishnah, which decrees that the children of Gentile women have the status of Gentiles, is that it is far from obvious that saying that someone with a Gentile mother is not uncomplicatedly Jewish and requires some kind of transition to actually be recognized as a Jew by the Jewish community. There's a far distance from that, and imagining that such a person is like any other Gentile that one finds out in the world who suddenly engages with Judaism and imagines that they want some kind of connection. Among the voices to recognize this, Rav Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, the first started chief rabbi of Israel, which is in the middle of the third page here, section C, engages specifically the question of what we would call someone who is patrilineally descended, and engages the question of how one deals with their conversion and what that process looks like. And in the second paragraph here, he says the following: from here we learn, a fortiori, that a patrilineal Jew brought by his father for a conversion should be accepted by the Beit Din, by the Jewish court. Even though this child is called the child of the Gentile woman, he is still considered Zera Yisrael, of Israelite stock. Everyone agrees that children of a Jewish man born to a Gentile woman are called Zera Yisrael. Therefore, and this is the key line, when the father brings him to convert, the child reverts to his original lineage. Uziel makes a very important claim, which is to say that insisting that someone with a Jewish father and a Gentile mother, for instance, needs to go and immerse in a mikvah in order to have their Jewish status recognized by the halachic tradition, does not mean that that process is actually metaphysically or even practically the same as the process of someone who comes on a kind of journey of self-discovery and exploration towards Judaism without having any ancestry or Jewish roots. And to underscore this point, Rav Uziel in another place actually emphasizes that this process is so different that when someone goes through it, on the other end, they actually don't even have the status of a convert. So in the way in which this gets played out, one of the black letter laws in the Shulchan Aruch, in the classic code of Jewish law, is that, worthy of its own day of investigation, is that a Kohen, a priest, is not allowed to marry a woman who has converted to Judaism. Troubling, difficult law, how we apply it, etc. But the law says as such. Says Rav Uziel, but a woman who has a Jewish father, who goes through an immersion in order to change her status to be Jewish according to the normative tradition, she may marry a Kohen. Because essentially what that process is, says Rav Uziel, is not a conversion process the way we think about it. It is a kind of unambiguous embrace of roots that this person already has in the Jewish community. And remembering the possibility, even within the Mishnah's world, of thinking very differently about that case of someone with a Jewish father, that's piece one of what I want to offer you for kind of complicating how we think about this issue. So that's the first path, the Jewish father and the Gentile mother, and ways in which we might nuance them. Now let's look briefly at the other side of the equation. Those with Jewish mothers and Gentile fathers. And here we can turn to the fourth page. Again, the biblical record seems pretty clear here. Such a person would have the status of a Gentile, would have the status of an outsider. It's important to note as well that for the most part in a patriarchal society, the Jewish community would almost never be presented with this case. The case of an actual intact couple of a Gentile man and a Jewish woman would, for the most part, in the ancient, medieval, and even much of the early modern world, have been a couple that would have ended up in the Gentile world, outside of the sphere of influence or control of the Jewish community. The cases where it would most come up would be cases either of some kind of illicit liaison between two such people, or in cases of rape or other kind of forcible relations where there really was no meaningful relationship to speak of at all. When we get to Chazal, to classical rabbinic sources, it's no surprise then that we find a great deal of discussion and debate as to the status of what we today would call matrilineal Jews. And what seemed simple to us was not so simple to them. There were many voices, in fact the dominant voices, that decreed that such people have the status of a mamzer, someone who has the status of a Jew, but is essentially forbidden from marrying any other Jew unless that other Jew also has some intractably problematic lineage of their own. And therefore, for many in the rabbinic conversation, equally those with a Jewish mother and a Gentile father would also have effectively been sort of maybe on the periphery of the Jewish community, but on the periphery and not in the center. Over time, there's a clear trend, and it culminates in the Talmud in Masechet Yevamot, on the following page, a long story. I encourage you to read at length. Quite moving and difficult passage in the Talmud that culminates in a ruling that says the halacha follows those who say that the child of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father is kasher, has valid, unproblematic status, and the matter would seem to have ended there. We now have the second half of the matrilineal principle. Just as a Gentile mother renders you a Gentile according to the Mishnah, the Talmud would seem to conclude a Jewish mother renders you a Jew. But in fact, the interesting thing about this topic is it's not so simple. And that in the Middle Ages, there were many who latched onto that word kasher, that word valid, the notion that a matrilineal Jew has valid status, and did not read it as meaning that that person is a Jew, but read it instead as meaning this person does not have any kind of lineal taint that cannot be addressed. Unlike the mamzer, who is stuck with this sort of problematic ancestry, the matrilineal descended person is kasher. How are they valid? Because they can convert and become a Jew, and upon converting, they have the status of any other Jew. But a whole line of medieval thinking that assumed that, in fact, either parent, being a Gentile, renders you having to go through some kind of ceremony, some kind of conversion to bring your Jewish status in line with those sources. I will show you just one example of this that is quite striking. You will see if you turn forward a few pages here, past the page that says C, Medieval and Modern Interpretation, to the page that begins with Mother, exclamation point, in the middle of the text. In the middle of that page, with the non-digitized script, the responsa tu tam vadat in the English there, a few sources up on the bottom. You can see as late as 19th century Poland, a case where a Jewish woman has a child via a Gentile man, and wants to bring that child to the synagogue to name him. And Rav Shlomo Kluger, who receives this question, says the following. Obviously, if a male Jew marries a Gentile woman, the offspring follows her Gentile status. That's the Mishnah's rule, that having a Gentile mother produces a Gentile child. But, says Rav Kluger, even if it is the reverse situation, and a Gentile man marries a Jewish woman, in which case the child follows her status, as is explicit in the Talmud and later decisors, nonetheless, God forbid that one should give that child a Jewish name. Chazal, the classical rabbinic source's intention in saying that the child is kasher, is valid, is simply to convey that it is not a mamzer, but it still requires conversion. Right? If we were to sort of take the key point of this conversation, when we actually think honestly about the halakhic data about matrilineal descent, we actually see that when honestly confronting the wealth of opinion out there, that it is not so simple in this direction either, simply to say that someone of a Jewish mother is uncomplicatedly regarded by the entirety of the tradition as being Jewish, without any issues whatsoever. What I think that brings us to, in terms of kind of complicating our thinking about this, are ways in which we might be more honest both to that data, but also to the data of lived experience as we see it today. I mentioned before that most of the sources that regard matrilineal Jews as uncomplicatedly Jewish are only dealing with situations where essentially the father is absent. The honest assessment of what it means to be raised by two parents, one Gentile and one Jewish, where both parents are present, is that it stands to reason that both of those parents actually have some kind of shaping influence, both on the cultural level, but also, again, coming back to the notion of descent mattering, on the very genetic level of what it means to talk about inheriting traditions, inheriting identity from one's parents in the first place. I think that a more nuanced conversation, and perhaps it can come up in the Q&A afterwards, around the Jewish community and Jewish status today, but actually acknowledge that what we really have in the sphere of the Jewish community are three types of people, three groups of people when it comes to thinking about descent. There are those who have two Jewish parents, who on the axis of descent are clearly uncomplicatedly Jewish in terms of what they have inherited from their parents. There are then those who have neither parent as Jewish, and clearly their journey towards Judaism is one that requires in a much more robust way the accepting of an entire story, an entire history that is not theirs by birthright. And then there is another group which has mixed heritage and mixed ancestry in both senses of that word. People who honestly and legitimately and simply descriptively have a place in the history of the Jewish people and the Jewish descent, and who also have something that those with two Jewish parents do not, which is another component that they have inherited, and something that I think both it makes sense as a matter of practical sense, but also in terms of honesty with the halachic tradition, is probably something that should be making a difference and factoring into how we think about this. Leave the rest for that.